appearance of the handbag in all three societies can be considered evidence of the natural mixing of ancient Middle Eastern civilization.
For decades, one small carved shape has been quietly hiding inside plain sight on the walls of an ancient palace. And once people finally noticed it, they couldn't stop asking what it meant. It looks almost absurdly familiar, a rigid arched handle rising above a squared body, gripped in the fist of a towering, winged figure carved into gypsum nearly 3,000 years ago. To modern eyes trained on shopping trips and airport terminals, it reads instantly as a handbag. And once that idea takes root, it spreads fast, because the same silhouette seems to show up again and again across the ancient world, on a pillar in Turkey that predates farming itself, and on a stone monument in Mexico carved by a civilization that, as far as anyone can tell, never had contact with the Near East at all. For years, this coincidence fueled theories about lost global civilizations and visitors from beyond the sky. But archaeologists who actually sat with the evidence, cross-referencing carvings with the written records left behind by the people who made them, found something far more grounded, and in its own way, far more remarkable. The clearest starting point sits in northern Iraq, in the ruins of a city the Assyrians called Kalhu and modern maps label Nimrud. Around 883 to 859 BCE, King Ashurnasirpal II built his capital there and filled its throne room with row after row of towering relief carvings, gypsum slabs taller than a grown man, once painted in colors long since faded, showing scenes of hunting, warfare, and ritual designed to overwhelm anyone brought into the king's presence. Among the carved soldiers and tribute bearers stand figures that are clearly not human. Broad-shouldered, muscular beings in fringed robes, wearing thick bracelets, with enormous feathered wings sweeping from their backs. Some have the bearded heads of men crowned with the horned cap reserved for divinity. Others wear the sharp-beaked heads of birds of prey. These beings are known from Mesopotamian tradition as Apkallu, sages said to have existed before the Great Flood and to have taught humanity the arts of civilization. On the palace walls, they function as guardians, stationed at doorways and thresholds, the exact points where evil was believed most likely to slip through into the world of the living. In one hand, many of these figures grip the object that would eventually go viral online, a container with a flat, squared base and a stiff handle arching over the top. In the other hand, almost always overlooked by anyone scrolling past a single striking image, they hold something else entirely, a small cone-shaped object, raised and extended toward a stylized tree of interlaced branches that scholars call the sacred tree, or sometimes toward the king himself. That second object is the detail that unlocks the whole puzzle, but it takes a trip through the archive of Assyrian ritual writing to see why. Assyrian priests left behind an enormous body of religious and magical texts, inscribed on clay tablets in cuneiform, describing rites meant to cleanse people, rooms, and kings from illness, curses, and bad omens. These texts name the two objects the Apkallu carry. The container is called a bandadu, an ordinary word for an ordinary bucket, the same kind of vessel a laborer might use to haul water or mud on any building site in the empire. The cone-shaped object is called a mullalu, a purifier or sprinkler. Scholars have been matching this vocabulary to the sculpture for more than a century, and the gesture carved into the stone lines up precisely with the ritual described in the texts. A priest or a divine being standing in for one dips the sprinkler into the bucket and shakes it toward whatever is being blessed, scattering droplets of consecrated liquid, most likely water, possibly mixed with oil or a fragrant compound. It is essentially a purification kit for the health of an empire, caught mid-use and frozen in stone. Excavators have even recovered actual bronze buckets from Assyrian palace ruins, some retaining residue consistent with water and plant matter rather than anything mysterious. The so-called handbag was never a container of forbidden knowledge or advanced technology. It was half of a cleaning ritual, and the ancient scribes told us so themselves in their own words, on their own clay. That would be a tidy resolution if the object only appeared in Assyria. It does not. Roughly 500 miles northwest of Nimrud, in the hills of southeastern Turkey, sits a site that has forced archaeologists to rewrite major parts of the human timeline. Göbekli Tepe was raised by hunter-gatherers around 9,600 BCE, more than 11,000 years before the present, by people with no writing, no metal tools, no wheel, and quite possibly no farming yet. They hauled multi-ton limestone pillars upright and arranged them into massive stone rings. Many of the pillars carved into T-shapes that some researchers believe were meant to stylize a standing human figure, arms carved along the sides, hands meeting at the front. German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, who led excavations there for years, came to believe the site functioned as a gathering place or sanctuary for scattered hunting bands who otherwise left almost no permanent architecture anywhere else in the region. Strangest of all, the enclosures appear to have been deliberately buried under tons of packed rubble at some point in antiquity, sealed rather than simply left to decay. On one pillar, catalogued as Pillar 43 and sometimes nicknamed the Vulture Stone, a dense scene includes vultures with outstretched wings, a curled scorpion, snakes, and birds, much of it still debated by specialists. Near the top of the composition, in a neat row, sit three small shapes, squared bodies, each topped with a curved arching line. To an eye already primed by the Assyrian carvings, they look unmistakably like three-handled containers, carved roughly 7,000 years before Ashurnasirpal II was born. That gap is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is larger than the distance between the Assyrian palaces and our own century. When these Turkish pillars were raised, the Sumerians did not yet exist as a civilization. There was no writing, no scribe, no possible channel through which a Mesopotamian religious idea could have traveled backward through time to reach these hunters. And yet the shape appears anyway, staring out from the deepest layer of the human past, offering no accompanying text to explain what it meant to the people who carved it. The trail does not stop there. On the opposite side of the planet, in the humid lowlands of what is now the Mexican state of Tabasco, the Olmec culture built a ceremonial center called La Venta, flourishing roughly between 1200 and 400 BCE. The Olmec are often called Mesoamerica's foundational culture, famous for colossal basalt heads and a recurring hybrid figure blending human and jaguar features that archaeologists still argue over the meaning of. Among the monuments recovered from La Venta is Monument 19, a carved slab showing a seated human figure wrapped in the coils of an enormous serpent, its open mouth arching over his head like a canopy. It is considered one of the earliest known depictions of a feathered or plumed serpent in Mesoamerican art, a motif that would echo for 2,000 years into later Maya and Aztec mythology. The seated figure holds one hand at rest by his side, and gripped in that hand is a rigid-handled, squared container that bears an uncanny resemblance to the object carried by the Apkallu at Nimrud, and to the trio of shapes carved above the vultures at Göbekli Tepe. La Venta sits roughly 7,500 miles from Nimrud, separated by oceans, mountain ranges, deserts, and thousands of years of societies developing in near total isolation from one another. No known trade route, no shared language, no archaeological evidence of contact connects the two. It is easy to see why this pattern has captivated so many people. Human beings are pattern recognition machines first and skeptics second, and a repeating silhouette spread across 3 continents and 11,000 years touches something old in how we are wired to notice the world. The strongest version of the argument for some hidden connection does not require aliens or a sunken continent to sound reasonable. It simply points out that unrelated cultures, dressing differently, burying their dead differently, worshipping different gods, do not typically converge on one identical object and attach it to a similar aura of sacred or divine significance purely by accident. That argument deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed outright. But it runs into a problem it has never satisfactorily answered. If a single forgotten civilization once spread its symbols across the globe, why did it apparently leave behind exactly one shared image and nothing else? Genuine contact between cultures tends to leave a much wider footprint. Shared vocabulary, matching units of measurement, similar building techniques, overlapping calendars, comparable tools. A handle container is a solution to an extremely basic, extremely universal problem. How do you carry liquid without spilling it, without soaking your hands, and without setting it down every few steps? There are only so many ways to solve that. A vessel wide enough to hold volume, a flat base so it can stand upright, and an arch above it so a hand can grip and lift without touching the contents. It is close to the shape a human hand arrives at almost automatically the moment it needs to carry something. This is not a unique case. Basket weavers on opposite sides of the world, with no possible contact, independently developed nearly identical coiling and twining techniques. Bow and arrow technology appears on multiple continents, without any shared point of origin. Pottery kilns across unconnected regions converge on similar shapes because clay, fire, and human need behave the same way everywhere they meet. A shared solution does not require a shared teacher. Sometimes the teacher is simply the problem itself, sitting in front of every group of people who ever had to solve it. Once that lens is applied, the more distant matches stop lining up quite as neatly as the viral images suggest. The Assyrian object has a name, a documented ritual, a partner object, and centuries of consistent depiction tied directly to written religious texts. That mystery is about as thoroughly solved as the ancient past ever allows. The Olmec object sits inside its own symbolic world, framed by a serpent motif tied to a completely separate mythology with its own calendar and its own cosmology, owing nothing to the Tigris River Valley. And the three shapes on Pillar 43 at Göbekli Tepe remain, honestly, unexplained. Convergent design shows those hunter-gatherers could easily have arrived at that shape entirely on their own, but it says nothing about what they believed it represented, or why they placed it above a procession of vultures and a curled scorpion. There is no scribe, no tablet, and no descendant tradition left to translate it. The scholars who study the site are candid about that limitation, and an honest account has to leave it exactly where they do, unresolved. What actually unravels this mystery, in the end, is not a hidden message smuggled across oceans by some vanished master culture. It is the discipline of actually reading the whole carving instead of half of it, and the discovery that the Assyrians, at least, wrote down precisely what they meant. The object in the Apkallu's hand was never a vessel of forbidden power. It was a bucket paired with a sprinkler, used in a purification rite performed at the doorways of a palace nearly 3,000 years ago, described in the priest's own words on their own clay tablets. The echoes that appear elsewhere in Turkey and in Mexico are most likely the fingerprint of a genuinely useful shape that different peoples kept rediscovering on their own, for reasons that turn out to be almost disappointingly practical. And underneath all of it, one door stays open on a hillside in Turkey, older than history itself, carved by people who left behind a shape without ever telling us what it meant to them, quietly refusing to give up its answer.